So we're going to kick off now with our second in the series of webinars on the topic of sustainability in a world growing in uncertainty. And I'm conscious that looking at the registration that we got people literally across all time zones. Thanks for those that are late at night and early morning watchers and participants. And I guess we were talking just before the webinar, we were talking about what was the gossip from around the world in the context of sustainability. And it's interesting, we have massive headwinds in the States, simplification in Europe, and China powering ahead in the East, filling what seems to be kind of this leadership vacuum across the world. And if for giggles, we just talk about business as usual. We have tariffs, we have a war in Eastern Europe, and, again, just for giggles again, AI massively changing business models. And I'm kind of minded in the context of uncertainty and the broadest sense of sustainability of the buggy whip story that I heard about 1,000 years ago, where the Ford Motor Company, when they came to the market with the Ford, the Model T, I think it was, the Model T. And before that, typically people transport themselves with a horse and buggy. But as it became evident that the Model T was taking over, the poor old buggy whip makers were saying, my God, we're out of business. Our futures are gone. And very, very many of the buggy, these whips that you use to get the horse to run faster and so forth, very many of them did go out of business, but not all of them did. A few of them said, well, hold on, this Model T has got 2 seats up front and they're leather. And the buggy whips are made of leather and so forth. So all we have to do is work out how we can reposition and maybe provide the leather seats or the leather whatever upholstery for these seats for the Model T. And that's kind of a segue into the whole question of sustainability in the broadest sense. Of course, climate, but the S topics as well. And asking ourselves in a kind of a very mixed up, fast moving, uncertain world in the context of environment, social, governance, those kind of sustainability topics, notwithstanding the political headwinds that we're seeing. Are investors, question to ask ourselves, are investors going to stop asking questions of companies? The answers to which those companies will give a hint to the investors of whether or not they're thinking about the future, whether or not their business models are viable and likely to perform sustainably into the future. Are banks going to stop reducing the risks across the portfolios? And by the way, for those here who are in receipt of credit ratings, you should know that on the back end of those ratings, there's also, with the principal providers, ESG ratings. And quite often people are horrified to see their very poor ESG ratings on the back of the credit ratings. And of course, then the question is customers. Tim, as we were saying earlier on, customers are looking for companies that are evidenced by their good actions and so forth. So folks, we're here to talk today about the what question. Last month, we spoke about why sustainability. This webinar is about what are companies going to do very practically in the context of this fast-moving, changing world that we're living in. And this What series, this whole series, by the way, is co-promoted, co-partnered with CQI, the Chartered Quality Professionals Organization, the Institute of Sustainable and Environmental Professions, PAFA, the Pan-African Federation of Accountants, and of course the ESG Exchange. I'm moderating here on behalf of the ESG Exchange, and we're partnering with the Pan-African Federation of Accountants in rolling out to hundreds of people starting last month their sustainability education. At the very end of this webinar, I'm going to ask all 3 panelists one common question. I'm going to ask them, what one thing, what one tool would they recommend to all of the attendees that they should pick up? Is it a podcast, a guidance, whatever? And in addition, what one practice, what one activity should they seek to introduce, or what new different approach might they consider that they might consider applying in their organizations, so that you, whilst tapping into this conversation between three global experts here, you might also walk away with some practical ideas with regards to tools and how to apply those tools. Martin Baxter is the Deputy CEO of the Institute of Sustainability and Environmental Professionals. He has performed and continues to perform senior leadership roles across European and international innovations and practices, particularly in the area of environmental practices. Interesting to see how the environmentalists have really pivoted to the broader area of sustainability, driving in on the business case. Lebegang, or Lebo Sine, is a chartered accountant from South Africa. Most recently came from IFRS, and today very involved with regulators and standard setters. Lebo is the kind of person who has the pen in writing the regulations, writing the guidelines, and so forth, and a major influencer across the continent of Africa in this whole space. Tim Latouche. Tim is a leading authority on environmental and management practices in business, with over 20 years experience as a global quality and environmental manager with Borough Hapload. I hope I've not done too much damage to my pronunciation there. And in that organization, he introduced the 14,000 series within that organization, and editor-in-chief of its first global sustainability report in 2019. With that, enough now with the introductions and the scene setting and the context setting and so forth. We're now getting our minds into what are companies to do practically. We've heard about the standards, but what are companies to do practically in the context of the business challenges facing them? And I'm going to start, Martin, with you in terms of, from a practical perspective, what should organizations do to balance actions and address long-term sustainability challenges? Because it's a very complicated kind of uncertain world we're living in today. What bets are they going to place? And what should they be doing in very practical terms to balance their actions, addressing their long-term sustainability challenges?
Well, firstly, thank you, Pedar, and good day to everybody wherever you are in the world. It's fantastic for ISET to be collaborating in this wonderful initiative, and I'm delighted to be able to speak on behalf of the organisation. And yeah, it's a big question that you've posed there, and I think we'll unpack it in a couple of different ways. The first thing I want to say is that it's well recognised now that climate risks are increasing faster than organisational and collective societal action to adapt. So we're pretty certain that our businesses, our communities are becoming more vulnerable and less resilient to impacts from climate change, which we know will occur. Okay, and we've got pretty strong evidence on the links between extreme weather and impact on climate, and the growing science of attribution provides a really clear picture on that. Okay, so that's something, and we often talk about the phrase we use is the tragedy of the horizon. So we can see what's coming along, and yet our short-term actions quite often overpower or control all of the resources to dealing with short-term pressures that businesses and organizations face. And we never quite get onto those longer-term things until it's too late. And that's where we're facing into at the moment. We're also seeing that we do have lots of the technologies, lots of the solutions to address the big challenges that we see. And deploying those at pace and scale is the challenge of our time. And in some ways, the good news is that, yes, there will be more inventions. Yes, there will be more innovation. But this is really around now how we organize ourselves and reorganize ourselves and our economies and our structures in order to deliver. I think for businesses, there are some very clear actions that they can take, and the global stock take under the Paris Agreement was pretty clear on what the actions need to be between now and 2030. And the two biggest things that can happen to get us to where we need to be are, one is a massive increase in the deployment of renewable power generation. So whether that's solar, wind, some hydro, etc. And the great news there is that that is cost effective in terms of generation, and also has the massive benefit of dealing with energy security. And you mentioned some of that unpredictable aspects of, for example, the war in Ukraine and the global disruption to fossil fuel-based power systems and the price hikes of that. And actually, the good news is that no country can hijack your wind or your sun. So if you have those technologies, then actually that becomes, a pretty safe solution. Secondly, the other massive opportunities around energy efficiency. And when you look at energy efficiency, this is not just turning off lights, being kind of really careful with your energy, but it's the transformation of how we use power in our businesses and in our economies. And on this, it's the move to electrification. So for many organizations. So on the one hand, in developed countries, a massive investment in electrification of transport and mobility is now cost effective in terms of lifetime ownership costs of cars, of vans, of scooters. So lots of that happening, and we're seeing that kind of offering big business opportunities for mid-tier countries. Actually, the global stocktake is very, very clear. It's about minimum energy efficiency performance standards for products. And the good news there is that those products are available at similar parity in terms of cost. They are cheaper to run, they're more efficient, actually, and they can all be powered by renewable energy. And the third one is kind of cook stoves and things like that, and actually helping to deal with people's quality of life. So what we see is that this massive move to electrification of the way in which we use power, and having that power generated by renewables, which are massively coming down in cost, actually provides a basis for businesses to start to plan their transitions in a way that helps them to address some of these risks and address some of the costs. And that's where kind of a big part of investment needs to be. Now, clearly, that's only one part of the overall picture that we need to be looking at. It's also about balancing investments to make our businesses more resilient and less vulnerable to things that we know. And I think here, one of the things that gives me probably a big concern, well, it gives me a big concern, not probably, it does, is that we know pretty much certainly that by the time we get to 2050, we will be at 2 degrees warming on average. And we're currently on about 1.3, approaching 1.3. We've got years now. Last year was tipped over 1.5, but that's not a long-term average. So the real question then is, businesses, if you really want to start to become more resilient, then you need to be looking at every investment decision that you make, looking at your business operations and asking the question, how well will we function and thrive as an organization in a 2-degree world? So I think that's something practically that people can do, because it will throw up some awkward challenges, but actually it will give you the insight that says this is where we have vulnerabilities. I think the bigger picture, and then I'll pause because I don't want to take all the time, is on this big global energy shift, we are seeing its effects rippled through the energy systems around the world. And I was delighted to read that last week, the Montana federal coal auction collapsed. Why did it collapse? Because for the 167 million tons of coal that they were looking to auction off, they had offers for the total of $186,000, i.e., pretty much zero. And why is that? Because there's no market for it. And so they've also cancelled the next federal coal auction. And the hope that I'm seeing, or the optimism that I can draw on, is that in this big strategic shift towards the deployment of renewables and electrification of economies more and more, that picture will accelerate around the world. And actually that then puts us on a trajectory for where we need to be. So I'll pause there, Padar.
Thank you. That Montana story is really quite intriguing. And what immediately shot into my mind, Lebo, looking at you, just transition in the global north doesn't mean the same thing as just transition in the global south,
Absolutely.
for example.
Absolutely.
So in a world today where there are really only just two constants, one is uncertainty and the other is pace of change. After that, everything is up for grabs. So in that world, Lebo, from your perspective, what should organizations be paying attention to when it comes to sustainability-related risks and sustainability-related opportunities, from your perspective?
Thank you, Peter, and my greetings as well to the attendees on this call. So, look, I think first it's important to just acknowledge that uncertainty really sits in, a neatly packaged box, but rather that it really spills over into resources which organizations depend on, often in very unexpected ways. If I think about a climate event, for example, it's not just an environmental risk. It can destabilize supply chain, communities, jobs, and then, of course, financial performance. So what organizations, in my mind, can pay attention to is how these shocks interact across different areas, because fragility often shows up in the spaces in between. But equally important is to also recognize that risks and opportunities sit on a bit of a spectrum, in that what looks like a disruption in one area may spark innovation in another. Martin just spoke a little bit about energy efficiency. And if I think about Africa, for example, what we saw is that energy insecurity has actually accelerated renewable investments and renewable energy projects that bypass fragile national grids. So it's like shifts like that, it began as a risk, but it has created an opportunity to leapfrog old systems. So essentially, in my mind, what matters most is for organizations to recognize the interconnections and ask themselves, where can disruptions erode resilience and where can it spark new value? I think the ability to see both sides, the risks and the opportunities, is what will set resilient organizations apart in this era of uncertainty, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you, Lebo. And just, I'm very mindful again just now of the reason we're all here. And this whole series of webinars, the why, the what, and the how. Next month is the how to implement, do stuff. It's inspired really by the ISO committee with responsibility for the global risk management standards. And that inspiration is causing us to query and to challenge on the whole the importance of anticipating, sensing big shifts that are ahead. But it's very difficult to do in a world that's kind of growing in uncertainty. So the little neat boxes we used to have in the past in the context of risks and so forth no longer exist. And of course, let's all kind of agree, I think, that a risk is just something that stands between where you are today and the objective you want to achieve tomorrow. That's all that is. And you can't achieve a worthy objective absent taking some risks, which is a good segue, Tim, into my question for you, I think, which is, what ways do you think can uncertainty affect and impact specifically sustainability issues?
Thank
Easy
you.
question, by the way.
Thank you, Peda, and yeah, and thanks very much for inviting me on here. One of the things you didn't mention about me earlier on is that I'm a member of the CQI, but I'm also a member of their sustainability special interest group, which is one of the reasons I'm on here, and I thought it's worth mentioning that. I have to say, what I'm going to say on that is going to echo a lot of what Martin has said earlier on and Lebon. But I'm kind of take us back just slightly and say, well, let's start talking about some of the things that are certain when it comes to sustainability. And one of the most obvious things that Martin was pointing out is that environment will continue to change and require us to adapt to these changes. You know, we talked about the 2-degree world in 2050. And the other related certainty is that the world population will continue to grow. And I believe that's projected to be 9 billion in 2050. And that will continue to put strains on many sustainability issues. But what is uncertain is exactly how the changes in the environment will impact all of us. We know changes are happening, and some of that, the pace of that change seems to be happening quicker than expected. But exactly how that will impact us as businesses is difficult. You know, I think that question that Martin posed of how will you function in a 2-degree world is quite a challenging one for people to understand. Of course, there are also a lot of uncertainties related to the political and human environment, as we've recently seen from decisions made in different parts of the world politically. But obviously the impact of those issues will differ depending on what part of the world you are operating in or what industry you work in as well. So, for instance, many parts of the world are more vulnerable to climate change, while others have been able to develop plans to address some of these issues. There are many businesses and organizations that consider sustainability as a significant issue, and this is impacting suppliers to those businesses as requirements are increasing. Requirements will differ, and contingency plans will be needed for different scenarios.
Thanks, Tim. And you know something? Lots of thoughts going back and forth in my head. I was in the States about 18 months ago, and a particular person asked me, he said, look, the climate's always been changing. Why are you guys getting so excited? I said, well, you're right, it's always been changing. And I said, you know, the day the meteor hit and killed all the dinosaurs, well, that was the bad day for the planet. But the planet did recover, and we had a beautiful planet that came out of it, the one we live in today. But in answer to the question as to why we're all getting so excited is that now I said, the world's got smaller all of a sudden. Tim, your point, heading to 9-10 billion people. Supply chains are getting longer. Everything is more interconnected. And the concern is that the pace of climate change is going to disrupt supply chains. And that's going to have a very adverse negative climate impact. So it's all about the economy, really. It's all about business impacts arising from this pace of change and so forth. So I guess, you know, Martin, that brings me into the question I have for you. We're living in a smaller, interdependent, interconnected world. And, you know, systems thinking is something we all hear about. It's a difficult thing to unpack. But from a systems thinking point of view, we're all in an ecosystem, we're all interconnected. What can our organizations be doing from that kind of perspective in the context of addressing their sustainability risks and opportunities given how closely together all these dominoes are stacked together and how one can upset the other and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important issue, and the complexity, even though things might be becoming smaller, the interconnections are complex, and the interdependencies have become more opaque. I think what that really does is organizations need to start to really map those interdependencies that they have with regard to both natural capital and nature, which we've not really touched on, but I think it's really important. It's very easy to get climate myopia in all of this, and we have sort of other big challenges that we need to face into. But I think it's understanding what the interdependencies are and where they are connected, and then getting a sense of where their vulnerabilities and opportunities are, and understand where they're going. And we've seen, organizations start to do this and actually have practical effect. And if I rewind over a decade, so I should mention I chair the group in ISO responsible for ISO 14001, and we published the latest version in 2015, and the impacts of a changing environment was something that were introduced as a consideration for organizations in that whole contextual analysis. And I had an ambulance service asking me, how do they deal with this as an organization? And I said, well, to my mind, it's really, really clear. Your core purpose is to be first on scene, saving people's lives. And actually, you are dependent on being able to get from one place to another really, really quickly. And in the location where this ambulance service was based was where there was well-known or kind of flood risk that has got worse. And so understanding where those risks are and being able to then plan different routes in advance allows them to take that action much more quickly, because they've taken a systems approach to their organization and where they have vulnerabilities. Another example that I'll just throw in here, when you do start to map those interdependencies and you understand where those vulnerabilities are, then you need to start to take some action. Nescafe, a couple of years ago, committed to $1 billion for regenerative agriculture for coffee bean growers in its supply chain. Why did it do that? Well, the impact of climate change on coffee bean growers is significant. And Nescafe without coffee beans is worth absolute zero as an organization. And so providing not only understanding where those interdependencies are between the quality of natural capital, climate-related risks, bringing those together that says, I have a vulnerability in my supply chain. Actually, the solution for me is I need to provide the finance support to go through that transition to regenerative agriculture from current agricultural practices, which reduces income for farmers and growers who will never therefore be able to afford to go on that journey on their own. Then that's around how you start to use systems thinking to enhance resilience of your supply chains. So I think it's really interesting when you see organizations actually starting to do practical things on this, understanding their systems, understanding how sustainability issues and factors might influence those and impact on them, and then start to map out, well, what might we do in order to address it?
Thank you, Martin. I just, as you were talking there, I just saw that 2 hands have gone up. And Evelyn, if you wouldn't mind just finding out what questions folk would like to ask, or better again, I promise to try and get us, this panel, through to at least 10 minutes on top of the hour. And maybe we'll just bring you on to ask your question to those folk that have asked a question there. So Evelyn, if you could maybe moderate that. Levo, I'm thinking about the poor buggy whip manufacturer faced with the onset of Ford on his or her business model, that was quite a simple challenge in some respects because only one thing that was facing them. But in our context here, it seems to me here now that it's all about, climate is just one sustainability factor. Okay, that's the biggest single drumbeat we're hearing in the world today. And it's about climate impacts on supply chains. And we've heard from Martin there in the context of interconnections and all of that. So in terms of now the companies, the organizations, those organizations that employ people, provide services and products to people, what shifts in thinking do they need to begin to undertake on the whole question of performance, on the whole question of resource allocation, on prioritizing resources towards whatever they want to achieve in the near, medium, and longer terms? Again, another easy question.
A very easy question, actually, Peter. And in fact, I don't think what I'm going to be sharing is going to be rocket science, right? But the reality is that the important shift is should be how performance in itself is understood. The word performance and the performance is understood in that, we know that in the past, performance was always about, measured exclusively in financial terms. Today, I think we can all agree that we expect organizations to be recognizing that it is a much broader concept, that it should include people, technology, relationships, and of course, natural systems. So back to Martin's point that it's not just climate myopia, there's an entire ecosystem that determines performance because the ability to manage all of those elements determines their ability to withstand shock, determines an organization's ability to withstand shock. Simple example, where an organization may be reporting strong performance, if its workforce, of course, is exhausted or its supply chains are fragile, that performance is honestly already under significant strain. So essentially, performance should no longer be about managing risk or seizing opportunity, but it's about doing both at once while also kind of making sure that all these other factors around people, technology, and relationships, etc., are being managed. When it comes to scarce resources, I think the shift is or should be about how trade-offs are approached. Where leaders once focused narrowly on immediate returns, now they're forced to weigh risks and opportunities together, knowing that, overemphasizing one at the expense of the other can absolutely undermine long-term returns. Scarcity, in my mind, pushes organizations to ask themselves, which risks do we mitigate and which opportunities do we bet on? And these choices cannot be siloed. They're no longer siloed. So my answer is that, what should organizations pay attention to? They really should pay attention to moving from a narrow financial definition of performance to a multidimensional one, and from short-term siloed resource trade-offs to integrated choices about risks and opportunities. Together, these, I believe, will redefine how resilience is built.
Tim, I'm thinking of a planning question that you and I discussed before, but I'm just conscious of one thing we should all remember, and that is, I guess, that this whole sustainability drive, the conversations that investors are having, that bankers are having, it's driven ultimately by the large funds, the pension funds. They don't think in terms of election cycles. They don't think in terms of quarterly results. They think in terms of 10, 20, 30 years down the road. Why? They're taking our monthly subscriptions on a fiduciary promise that when we retire, that we will have a good income based on how well they invested our monies today. So the pension funds are driving everything and the conversations at a G20, G7 level. And that's trickling down now to businesses. And effectively, it seems to me that it's all about CEOs now thinking in terms of their their long-term storytelling, linking effectively, you spoke there about all the capitals. Financial is just one capital, human capital, intellectual property, all the other capitals as well. And so, again, another non-trivial question for you, Tim, in the context of this is seriously complex stuff. How are organizations expected to plan for this? What should they be considering in terms of their planning approach to this whole array of uncertainties and so forth? What advice can you give to people?
Well, so being a quality professional as well as an environmental professional, I'm going to come at this question from a sort of quality and system perspective. Because systems thinking is essential when considering sustainability, because of the multiple impacts and independencies that Martin has talked about, and interactions with nature, with political and human environment. So this also means that you need a high level of collaboration across organizations to identify and address these interactions. So it's beneficial to consider large parts of your management systems as frameworks rather than detailed processes and methods, so that you can be agile and can respond to uncertainties. It will be important to ensure that the outcomes of the processes are clear. And taking up Le Bon's point, those outcomes have to be beyond the financial. They have to be much broader to consider your business as a sustainable business that can serve those pension funds that you talked about. But there needs to be clear prompts and guidance along the way. There's still some elements of your systems where there is prescription, should we say, will be necessary because there are certain red lines and things that you need, but they need to be minimized to critical business or operational issues. On the other hand, there are going to be areas where systems cannot be too prescriptive, as this may not align with responding to an increasing changing environment in the broadest sense. So having that element of flexibility is going to be important.
Flexibility. I mind it in the risk, in the ISO committee that I serve on, the risk management committee. People talk about resilience and so forth, and the traditional thinking was after an adverse event, abnormal adverse event, you would seek to bounce back to your original state. But to your point about agility and pace of change, why bounce back to an original state? You need to bounce ahead of the competition and your circumstances and so forth. And then in the context of AIs and so forth, the world hasn't done this before. This type of complexity, how everything is so tightly connected and interdependent. We're in a world where we expect, there's an AI will have an answer to my question. But in truth, it really comes down to us people to work things out. So one of the capitals, to Leva's point about the multiple capitals and so forth, and I know, Martin, this is a very big aspect of your life, what you do in ISCP, but we haven't done this before. So what do organizations need to do, just in the context of people, in the context of their workforces, their capacity and capability to address this, this array of change that's ahead of us all? It's really trying to run up a very steep hill whilst keeping the business going, generating profits and so forth, and accommodating all this change. So it's all down to, big part of it, down to the people, the workforce, capability and capacity. What should organizations do?
Thanks, Pedro. And I think this is so important because people are going to be doing the work that needs to be done to get us to where we need to be. And if we don't equip them with the insights, the knowledge, the experience, the skills, then it will not happen. I'm pretty certain about that. From our perspective, what we see are three broad areas. And this is from some research that we did with Deloitte and more recently published in our State of the Sustainability Profession earlier this year. And of course, I'm going to start by saying, actually, supporting skills development for your sustainability team, depending on how that's deployed, if you have them, really important. Secondly, I think where we are seeing real benefit is just bringing everybody up to speed with a basic understanding of key sustainability issues and why they matter to their organization and where their organization is and those dependencies. And that can be done at scale. One of our corporate partners is just getting towards the end of training 72,000 people on a basic sustainability awareness program across its global workforce to provide a baseline against which it can then start to drive more focused learning and development programs and workforce planning into different job functions and areas. What I would say is that is really encouraging on that is that they got a really, really good feedback from everybody. So it's not often that you get mandatory training that everybody has to do and you get 4.4 out of 5 when you've got so many people go through that. So I think that that's really good because it connects into people's, not only their work, but also it does have a bearing on day-to-day life as well. And I think that's important. The third one, though, is that it's the recognition that different roles and functions might change over time, depending on the trajectory that your organization is going to be on to not just survive this transition, but actually to thrive in it. And for some job roles, I'll give you an example in a minute, but for some job roles, it might just be that you will be applying new knowledge, but you'll be doing that role and that work in exactly the same way, just with new insights. It might be that you need new skills because the way in which that work will be done will be different. And therefore, you need to plan, well, how do we acquire those skills? Is it within our organization? Is it external to our organization? And then thirdly, it's around those behaviors and the approach that people take and how you incentivize that. So I think, if I take procurement, yes, there is so-called sustainable procurement, but I want all procurement to be sustainable. For quite a lot of this, it's about applying new knowledge. So it's about being able to procure with cost, quality, carbon and sustainability, and then bringing insights from that into how you then structure contracts and understand your supply chains and incentivize them. Or it's around how you deal with product design and how do you leverage in an understanding of the relative impacts and benefits of different material choices and configurations using, for example, life cycle assessment. Now, what we found was that there were some very big manufacturing organizations that had done this really, really well on maybe one or two of their products, but it required a massive amount of support from their sustainability team. So then it becomes a case of, well, if we want to mainstream this, we have to find different tools for our design team to utilize that will be able to draw on relevant data sets, which the sustainability team will provide, but then you'll train the designers to utilize this information and insight in a different way and provide those tools. So it's about them building a more bespoke set of learning and development opportunities for people in different roles and functions to then say, actually, we're going through this period of change. And we talk in our profession about obviously technical skills and that technical knowledge and insight really important. But then it becomes a question as well as, okay, well, what are the skills that you need that drive change? So we talk about transferable and transformational skills. So it is, teaching people about systems thinking, about communication and partnership and collaboration. No one organization can do this on its own. And yet we don't tend to teach that about partnership working and collaborating. It's all like, oh, we need our engineers to do this, but actually your engineers need to be kind of multifaceted in those things as well. So I think it's about taking a holistic approach to what does workforce planning and development really look like in different roles and functions, depending on your sector and your location, and then tailoring that to being the best that you can be as an organization. The final point I would make is that by doing that, you will be an organization that is able to attract and retain the most talented people, because people want to be part of the solution to the challenges that we face. And if you can face into that, then actually that's exciting, that's interesting, that's innovative, that's fun.
Hey, thanks, Martin. I'm just looking at the results of the poll that we ran a moment ago, and to the question, my organization has a very clear understanding of the climate and other related risks and opportunities. 26% said they fully agree, 66% said they partially agree. So, and then 8% do not agree. There's a lot of people not too sure by that result. And I'm mindful of what I said a moment ago about really we're all here because of the trickle-down effect from the pension funds. They're really worried when they take a long-term view, and they're having to distinguish between those companies that are going to adapt and those companies that are going to die, because not everybody is going to thrive. Some will barely survive. They want to find those that are really ahead of the game in adoption terms, and you have to begin to identify the issues. So my last question for you, Level One, it's an easy one. In terms of distinguishing those that are going to adapt and those that are likely going to die, what distinguishes the organizations that fall into these are going to adapt, these are going to die buckets? What are the hallmarks of a company that is likely to thrive, not just survive, but thrive into the future?
I think it really just comes down to agility, right? The ability to act without waiting for perfect information, whether it is around business model, whether it is around the workforce training or reskilling. Organizations that fall behind often, in my mind, default to defensiveness. They will cut costs, they'll protect today's financial performance and delay decisions until the picture feels clear or perfect. So that, in my mind, that buys short-term stability, but I really think it limits the ability to adapt when shocks arrive. By contrast, I believe that agile organizations tend to move even while the future is still uncertain. And a good example is kind of what we saw during the pandemic, where companies that quickly repurposed their supply chain or accelerated digitalization rebound faster than those that waited. Today, we're seeing others using climate pressure or regulatory changes as a spark to reimagine business models rather than resisting until it is absolutely unavoidable. For me, both examples show that where sustainability rather is not an add-on, but is embedded. Where sustainability is not an add-on, but is embedded in the response, it really turns disruption into a source of competitive edge. So short and sweet, agility.
Again, about 1,000 years ago, I was an old soldier. Well, a young soldier back in those days, a bit older now. And one of the things that we learned when faced with unpleasant things was you had to declare who was going to declare, for example, a crisis, who was going to declare this, declare that, to shift mindset, not just resources. And it seems to me that probably at a leadership level is the one biggest single thing that folk need to do. Just to call out the obvious, the world is changing fast. We've got to change our mindset and so forth. So, which kind of segues me into my last question for you, Tim. And if you don't mind, I want to be fast on this because I don't know what questions were coming from the floor, but I'd like Evelyn to be able to pose those questions, or maybe Evelyn, you want to introduce the actual participant to give her question to the panel directly. But Tim, quickly if you can, there's lots of impacts facing organizations. Those impacts are having effects on company prospects today. And if they're not having impacts on cash and performance today, they will have on tomorrow. So, what are organizations to do in terms of managing and developing their people? It's kind of a segue on from Martin's point earlier on, indeed. But
Indeed,
at the level of the people involved.
it is. It's very much a segue on that. So, I agree a lot, mostly with all that Martin was saying about there. And so I'm just going to make a few additional points, really, and maybe emphasize those. So, and particularly, I'm following this on from when I was saying that systems need to be frameworks, and therefore you need to equip your employees and empower them to be able to make decisions that maybe they wouldn't have made previously. But preparing your employees for an uncertain world means that they need to have that ability to learn new things, and that's going to be a key competence, that ability to learn new things, as well as requiring high levels of collaboration. So understanding how to collaborate with other people, which often can be great because everybody wants to do it. Sometimes it isn't so great. So how do you go about persuading people that collaboration is necessary, because these solutions need that collaboration? So it's quite a lot of soft skills there, maybe more soft skills than maybe there's been traditionally there. There's been a focus on technical skills, a lot more about how do I collaborate, deal with people, how can I make them see the benefit of collaborating with me, So I think that's really the main points I would make about that important area.
Before I get into my last question, let me go to the floor for a question. I remember in one of my travels having a situation, and the person I had left said, Father, with regards to this problem that we have here, my head is in heaven, but my feet are on the ground. And when it seems to me that in the context of my takeaway from this conversation so far is, yes, we've got to be concerned about climate and the environment and society. That's where my head is in heaven. But when I look at the results of the poll, the last poll there, with regards to sustainability drivers, I'm interested in seeing that 44% of people fully agree that the drivers for them are either investor banking or customer driven. And 40% partially agree with that. So this really is all about the business, right? Safeguarding economic activity, viability and performance. Because you know what they say, the hungry man or woman becomes the angry man or woman. And we're seeing a bit of evidence of that with the rise in certain movements
Can I
across the
just
world.
add in one further
Yes.
point? I was at a conference recently and I was listening to human resource professionals talking about developing skills in their workforce. And they were suggesting that employees in many industries can expect to be retrained every 3 years, when that used to be 10 or 20 years. So things are changing.
Wow. That's a big, yeah. Fun times ahead. My last question for everybody. Very quickly, I want to get to the question from the floor. My God, I've only got 4 minutes to go. What's the one big tool that you point out to people that they should listen to, read, pull down and read, and what one action should people take that's different to what they were doing yesterday, arising out of this conversation? First, over to you, Martin, in 30 seconds.
Yeah, very, very quickly. So have a look at the underlying frameworks and the financial kind of planning in the task force for climate-related financial disclosures, because it's a way of engaging your finance team. Don't worry as much about the governance and the performance. Actually look at how this translates through your organization from your risks and dependencies into cash flow, into income, into the value of assets and ask yourself, at what point will your investors, your lenders, your banks not support you? And do the same as well for nature-related dependencies, so the task force on nature-related climate disclosures. And then, and then secondly, go away and use our All Jobs Greener toolkit that we developed with Deloitte to benchmark where you are on a maturity matrix about the organization's readiness to address all of these challenges. Do it with more than one person in your organization, pick half a dozen, and then ask yourselves why you have varying answers to one set question about how ready your organization for the challenges ahead. Because by exploring that, you will develop new insights around developing a common understanding. It's only with that that you can have the framework to go forward.
Cool. I think you provided links, Evelyn's provided links in the chat for folks to pick up those 2 documents. Lebo, same question for you.
So I'd like to highlight the Capitals Coalition protocols. I believe they provide a practical way to understand how uncertainty affects natural, human, and social capital, and to bring those insights into everyday decision making. What I value most about them is that they help organizations surface risk and opportunities across the capitals, which is critical when resources are scarce and choices have to be made. For leaders and teams and boards, the protocols offer a structured way to see where capitals are under pressure and where resilience can be strengthened. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Lebo, for that. Absolutely. Tim, same question for you. And Evelyn, please hit us with the question. I hope you've got something nice and neatly packaged. I do apologize. I haven't managed our time well. My apologies for that. Tim, the same question for you.
So very quickly, I would recommend that the B Corp impact assessment, which is a free online tool using B Impact. I believe they're also developing new self-assessment tool from beginning of 2026. That's a good tool to consider sustainable issues holistically that align with sustainable development goals. And that would also help to consider possible areas of uncertainty.
Great stuff, Tim. Evelyn, and by the way, I saw Glenn just published a book and an incredibly renowned international expert. I would recommend highly that people would take a look at his brilliant recently published book. Evelyn, what do you have for us in a minute?
We have a minute remaining, so let's just dive quickly into the question that got the most attention. Zoe posed a great question on innovation and wants to know the role that it plays in truly driving sustainability, with how we see that it is characteristically and seemingly playing in quite an important role with everything discussed, training, maintaining, all that. Just to the panelists, how do you see the role of innovation? How is it a driving force for people?
Right, I've got to make a decision. Martin, I'm going to throw that into your lap. If you could just grab that ball in less than a minute.
Yeah, innovation is really important because innovation can help to drive down the costs of the technologies that we know are part of the solution. And I think that's the really big thing. And because driving down costs helps us to scale up solutions to the problems that we face. So I think it's dead center and really valuable as helping us go on this journey.
Folks, thank you all. We've just finished now at the top of the hour. Our next webinar in this series is the How webinar on the 25th of November. And I hope you've taken value from this. My panelists, it takes a lot of effort and thinking and time to contribute, participate, coordinate these webinars. And thank you so much for your time. And to the wonderful Evelyn on the back end there, making everything work away so smoothly. Thank you, Evelyn. Everybody, have a great day. God bless and thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.